Hello and welcome to this first of a June Pride video series on the LGBTQ movements in the church and how St. Simon's might be a more affirming participant in those movements, how we might truly affirm the presence of people that bear differences of sexual orientation or gender identity, and how we might kind of introduce that into the culture of our church or expand what is already there. So the next 3 weeks, we'll have 3 different videos that we'll talk about on Sunday. And today, I'm up to talk a bit about same-gender marriage, which, as we know, is one of the flashpoints and a big source of argument in churches when it came to welcoming same-gender couples particularly, so especially people who identified as gay or lesbian and wanted their marriages recognized as we recognize different gender couples, heterosexual couples. Now, we might take it for granted that one of the signs of an affirming church is that it would welcome couples to celebrate their marriages regardless of the gender of the parties. And we might be tempted to believe that the Episcopal Church has led the way in that, right? I mean, as we so often say, the Episcopal Church welcomes you. Now, there's a surprise in store because I think the story is a little bit more complicated than that. And so what I'd like to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so is talk about how we got here to where we are, where indeed in our church, people are free to marry regardless of their gender. But I thought instead of starting back in the past, I thought we might start right now in the present and slowly unpack how we got here, unravel a bit the welcome we now offer to same-gender couples who want to get married. Now, I'm going to be asking some hard questions as I do so because our charge this month is to try to deepen or expand our understanding of how we welcome or even more affirm same-gender couples, for example. So as I lead us back in time, I invite you to perhaps think a little bit about your own attitudes towards same-gender marriage, both now and as it's developed over time. How has your own thinking and feeling about it changed? So let's start this year, 2020. In 2020, throughout the Episcopal Church, same-gender couples have the religious right to marry. The only limitation on a same-gender couple being married in the Episcopal Church are the same limitations that apply to same-gender couples, and also still that individual clergy can decline to witness their weddings if they have some theological problem with it. But even in that case, they're duty-bound to help the couple find someone who can witness their marriage. Now, I should say that clergy can technically decline to witness the marriage of any couple, but not really because they're a different gender. I couldn't refuse to marry an opposite gender couple. We're allowed to decline, at least for a time, to witness the marriage of a couple if we have reservations about their ability to consent to getting married, that is, if there is a dangerous problem. So given that here in 2020, there are no obstacles to a same-gender couple getting married, how many same-gender couples have celebrated their weddings in St. Simon's Church building? How many have there been? Or how many of St. Simon's clergy have witnessed same-gender marriages as part of their ministry at St. Simon's? I mean, sometimes we do marriages of people that we know and we have permission to do, but specifically, say, as the rector or associate rector of St. Simon's, how many of your clergy have witnessed those marriages as a part of the ministry of the church? I think that number is probably still small. Now, is that because same-gender marriage in the Episcopal Church is something relatively new? Now, let's see if that's right. How did we get here? So let's dial it back just 2 years. At the General Convention of the Episcopal Church in 2018, the Episcopal Church actually completed its move to what we call marriage equality. And they completed it by no longer permitting bishops to refuse permission to their clergy to witness a same-gender marriage. So the Bishop of Chicago could not say to any of our clergy, "I forbid you to do it," as a matter of church law. They may not like it, but they cannot forbid it. Now, our diocese has in general permitted clergy to do so, so at least since 2011, which is about the time Illinois created civil unions for same-gender couples, clergy in the Diocese of Chicago have been allowed to witness those unions, whether we call them marriage or not. But really that means that the issue of same-gender marriage or marriage equality in the Episcopal Church was just completed 2 years ago when bishops lost the ability to prevent them from happening. So that's 2018. Let's move it back 3 more years. In 2015, the General Convention changed our church law, what we call the Canons, so that any couple, regardless of their gender, can use the Book of Common Prayer to get married. That is, we can use the liturgy that's in the Book of Common Prayer to have their marriage, which we call the witnessing and blessing of a marriage. Now, up to that point, same-gender couples were technically not allowed to use that liturgy. It was still reserved for heterosexual couples 3 years ago. I don't think that all couples and clergy colleagues of mine followed that rule, but that was the rule up until 2015. In 2015, that same General Convention also allowed heterosexual or different gender couples to use what we call the witnessing and blessing of a lifelong covenant. And that is the specific liturgy that was created just for same-gender couples and approved in 2012. At that time, though, same-gender couples had to use that liturgy that was just for them, and different gender couples had to use what was in the Book of Common Prayer. They couldn't switch back and forth. So now in 2015, 5 years ago, the church allowed same-gender couples to call their relationships a marriage in the same way that different gender couples could, and then immediately permitted different gender couples to use a liturgy that was created for same-sex couples. So we would call that like a big step toward marriage equality. We can actually use the word marriage for a same-gender couple now. Dial it back 3 more years. You're detecting a pattern. In the Episcopal Church, we have big general conventions every 3 years. So that's why we're doing 3-year increments right now. So in 2012, that was the year the General Convention approved that witnessing and blessing of a lifelong covenant. That was a liturgy only for same-gender couples, and they were pretty serious about it. Even here in our diocese, which tends to be more open, our diocese issued a policy to make it really clear, and this is a quote from that policy. We, the Diocese of Chicago, understand holy matrimony to be an estate the Church offers to heterosexual couples. We understand holy union to be an estate that some parts of the Church offer to homosexual couples. This means that members of the clergy in the Diocese of Chicago shall neither offer the solemnization of a holy union to a heterosexual couple, nor the solemnization of holy matrimony to a homosexual couple. So now as we get back 8 years ago, we can start to see the tension that was resolved now, but was still there 8 years ago. They wanted to make sure we saw a difference between a same-gender couple and an opposite-gender couple. Now that was 2012, and that little chunk of time kind of encapsulates how we got to marriage liturgies. But we could make one more big jump back from 2012 to 2000. And it's really in the year 2000 that the General Convention started thinking in a little bit to just how the church might recognize what they called committed relationships other than marriage, a very Episcopal way of saying same-gender or homosexual relationships. But we were talking about relationships other than marriage, right? So this is now 20 years ago. And what the convention did is they passed a resolution that directed the church to explore ways of recognizing committed relationships other than marriage. And this is a quote, provided that they be characterized by fidelity, monogamy, mutual affection and respect, careful, honest communication, and the holy love which enables those in such relationships to see each other in the image of God. Sounds great, almost a perfect relationship, right? Although I've got to say that I don't know many relationships that are able to hold all that together at the same time always. But obviously that was the thinking of the church about the kinds of relationships we're talking about. The thing is that the very next words in that resolution that was going to open the conversation about same-gender marriage said this. The language that immediately followed said that the church denounces promiscuity, exploitation, and abusiveness in the relationships of any of our members. Now, I gotta say, as a gay person, I was wondering why you had to add those pretty strong caveats just as you tried to say something positive, as if allowing relationships other than marriage might open the door to such abuses, many of them. And I can't help but hear certain stereotypes at work about gay men in particular. Why did they need to say promiscuity? When we know, or at least I know from my experience, that is a stereotype that many people apply to gay men, at least then, and probably now sometimes. Now, maybe it's there and maybe it's not, but when I look at that lovely image of the kind of relationship we want to affirm, followed immediately by all these bad things, I think that reflects some anxiety in the church about that time. We were afraid to open that conversation. Well, that's a 5-minute, super big picture version of how the Episcopal Church got to same-sex marriage. And it looks like an 18-year official journey from 2000, when the General Convention invited us to think about it, to 2018, when we got to what we call marriage equality. But the truth is, that is actually less than half of the story. And that's because same-gender couples didn't wait around for big churches to give up their thumbs up. If we had, we wouldn't have same-gender marriage now. Same-gender couples had been getting married in various ways for decades before that. As early as 1968, Troy Perry, who founded the LGBTQ-identified Metropolitan Community Church, was witnessing same-gender marriage. The Roman Catholic group Dignity, which was founded around 1969, has been celebrating them since the 70s. And when I first came to Chicago in the 90s, one of the first things I did there was help out with preparing what we then called union ceremonies. But we just used the Roman Catholic rite of marriage when we did it. The Episcopal Church, too, has a much longer history. The Church of the Holy Apostles, which is in New York, way back in 1971, so 2 years before I was born, was already celebrating friendship ceremonies, using more or less the marriage liturgy from the BCP. 50 years ago. I've attached a link to a short article here that you can read about it if you're curious. It is an interesting story. But my point is that even in 1971, the Bishop of New York, whose name was Paul Moore, if a little grudgingly, permitted the rector, Robert Weeks, to continue to do these same gender recognitions, even after many Episcopalians objected. 50 years ago. Same-gender marriage in Episcopal churches is really not all that new. All of which is to say it took 45 years of activism by LGBTQ Episcopalians and some Episcopal congregations to get the church to move on to same-gender marriage. In fact, like Dignity in the Roman Catholic Church, there was a group called Integrity, which still exists in the Episcopal Church, that lobbied all those many decades for changes in the way the church thought about sexuality and marriage. But I gotta say, even then, the church as a whole moved more or less with society. In 2015, the Supreme Court made same-gender legal marriage everywhere legally, in every state. And that's the exact same year the General Convention permitted same-gender couples to use the marriage liturgy of the BCP. In other words, we followed the culture. The Supreme Court said it was okay, and so did the General Convention in 2015. And I gotta say, I would hardly call that prophetic or even affirming. There was nothing particularly unusual about the Episcopal Church in the relation to the rest of society. So let's go back to that question. Over 50 years, how many same-gender weddings has St. Simon's hosted? And what about your clergy? Have they always felt permitted, as rector or associate rector of St. Simon's, to witness such a union? Now, first off, I want to say I am confident that if I asked St. Simon's to host a religious wedding for David and I, St. Simon's would be eager to do so. But that's not quite the same as being affirming as part of our everyday mission. Right now, that kind of wedding would still be an exception in the practice of St. Simon's. And that's not just St. Simon's. Most Episcopal churches of my experience, most of them, have yet to host their first same-gender marriage. St. Augustine's, which was my former parish in Wilmette, where I served, and who were also very welcoming, welcomed David and I very much, just witnessed its first same-gender wedding last year, and that's that I am aware of, which was the wedding of their associate rector and his husband, members of the clergy. In other words, it wasn't someone from outside the community who walked in the door off the street confident that they would receive the affirmation that of course you can get married in our church. It was a clergy person. And I have to say, sometimes among LGBTQ clergy in our diocese, one of the things that we talk about is that churches seem ready and willing to welcome LGBTQ persons among their clergy. But often we remain the only LGBTQ person in the church. So while it's great that our calls and ministries are warmly welcomed by the church, it takes a lot more work to make the church more affirming, so that a clergy person who is LGBTQ, or gay in my case, isn't an exception to almost everybody else that's there. So here is, for me, I think, the difference between what I'll call an affirming church and one that welcomes, as good as it is to be welcoming. The affirming churches of that 45 years of activisms all had to take risks. They all had to engage conflict. They all had to get out in front to bring about change. And it's because there were affirming congregations way back then ready to make those risks that we have same-gender marriage now. Behind those affirming churches, the ones that will really get out there have come other churches. Churches ready to work on their welcome, to explore how people might feel excluded. And finally, at the very end of the train, the larger church institutions that come along. That is to say, I don't think that our national church is necessarily all that progressive. Whatever has come out of the national church came out because local congregations started to push at the edges and then started to evince other congregations to come along so that we got a bigger group of folks that wanted to make a change. And that is how social change works, usually from the bottom up, because it can take a long time to get a majority to concede that it is being exclusionary. In this case, a heterosexual majority that had excluded same-gender couples from things like marriage and everything that comes along with it. So my question for St. Simon's is twofold. First, if you want to be known as an affirming church, it has to be easy for a same-gender couple or a same-gender couple with a family to know it. They shouldn't need to ask. So what does St. Simon's need to do? How does St. Simon's need to present itself so that a same-gender couple wouldn't need to ask? That the minute that they encountered St. Simon's, they would know that not only are they welcome, we need and want you here. Even more, I, for one, want to know that I am welcome not as some kind of exception to another wise rule, but that the church both wants and needs the differences I bring as a gay person in particular. So if we want to be affirming as a church, we basically have to announce it in everything that we do, especially since our culture still sees churches in general as opposed to same-gender marriage, which is certainly the case. And announcing that is more than flying a pride flag in June. It has to go all the way through our culture. The second question I think is a little bit harder, and it's the one I'm thinking about for myself. Where is the edge of being an affirming church now? Because I gotta tell you, same-gender marriage I don't think is really an edge that much anymore. It's legal in the whole United States. There might be people that resist it, but at least in the Episcopal Church, it's part of the culture. It's not edgy, really, I don't think. What risk might St. Simon's take to be affirming? To either affirm LGBTQ people in a way that challenges the world around, or to engage other kinds of differences that are marginalized, maybe differences that somehow have some kind of moral question associated with them, which is why LGBTQ people have been pushed out of the church for so long. We've been thought of as sinful in some way because of our difference. Now, maybe the kinds of affirmation we're talking about is connected to LGBTQ plus communities, and maybe not. Or maybe it's connected to intersections among those differences. I imagine it can be difficult enough to be an African American person in a place like Arlington Heights, where more than 80% of the people who live there are white. I can imagine it be even more challenging to be an African American woman with a same-gender partner and children. What would it be like to signal all to Arlington Heights that all these differences are not only welcome but affirmed, that we know we have something to learn from the differences that we gather? I would like to be a part of a church like Holy Apostles back in 1971, and there are others, who decides to get out in front, to risk its reputation for the sake of expanding our vision of who belongs, because we know that the gospel vision is that everyone belongs. Our job at St. Simon's is to figure out what that looks like in Arlington Heights. If someone were writing 50 years from now about churches that press the edges, as Holy Apostles did in 1971, what would they be writing about in 2020?